Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this, the third and final session in the Collectors Forum presentations. My name is Federico Freschi, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you here and to welcome our esteemed panelists, which I'll introduce to you as we go along. The session's called Collecting Art and the Evolution of Consciousness, a title suggested by Warren Siebrits. We have three prominent collectors here: Emil Stipp, Somali Kienge, and Orban Sugbe. And then, of course, Warren Siebrits, who is not only a collector, but also a gallerist, a curator, and generally a man about town in terms of the South African art world. So I'll ask our three collectors to kick off and tell us a bit about their collections and their, what it is that informs their collecting practices, how their consciousness has evolved in relation to their collections. And then we'll ask Warren to do something of response to that, but his response is also, part of his own philosophy about collecting. So we'll kick off with Emil. Emil Stipp is an actuary, has been collecting contemporary South African and African art since 2005. His collection includes art from the 1960s onwards, but with particular emphasis on art made since 1994. More recently, he has developed passion for video art. He tells me that he lives in Pretoria with his partner and their two golden retrievers, who presumably are part of the collection. Emil's going to tell us about his personal philosophy of collecting art, and will illustrate this with reference to works in his collection. Emil, welcome and thanks.
Thanks, Federico, and thanks, Sylvia, for the invitation. So I thought I should follow a slightly philosophical approach to basically explain my thinking in collecting art. And to start off with, I recently read a book by Arthur C. Danto, who's a famous critic, but he said that he tried to encapsulate what art is all about in that book. And what he said is that art basically needs to meet two criteria. It has to have meaning, and it has to have embodiment. So the meaning is captured in some object or in some way in the artwork. And then the viewer of art needs to meet one criteria, which is to interpret it. And I think that's actually a very neat summary of what art is all about, and particularly how contemporary art is currently perceived. So I'd like this quote from Barbara Gladstone, one of the dealers in New York. She said that art is an intellectual pursuit. It is not a handbag, it's not a chair, it's something else. So it's necessary to think, to ask questions, and to understand. And what I'd like to do to properly appreciate the meaning of art is to collect artists in depth. So what I typically want to do is to collect several works by the same artist. But then if I want to extract that meaning properly, and if I want to collect in depth, then there should be no restrictions on the medium. So I don't collect only painting or sculpture. I think a collector has to be open to all forms that the artists choose to use. And hence in my collection there's video and performance and artist books and photographs and everything. But there are, of course, limitations. So nobody can collect everything. Nobody has limitless funds. So I prefer to focus on art from South Africa and Africa. And the question is, why then collect contemporary art from Africa? I like this infographic. What it basically shows is that Africa has the same land area, the same sort of surface area as the whole of China, the whole of the United States, Japan, Europe, and India. And I think if one thinks about that, you realize that African art has not really been recognized on the international scene for a long time. But Africa has so much potential. And for that reason, I think that if one collects African art now, if we look back in 30 years, we'd be very, very glad that we did, simply because of this developing potential. And collecting contemporary art, I prefer to focus on contemporary. It's the art of our time, and at its best, I think it sheds light on what it means to be human at this time and in this place. So what I'd like to do very briefly is just to explain this sort of background philosophy with some examples from my collection. What I've done here is not to show one artist's work in depth, which is the approach that I take, but rather just to show one or two examples from each artist's work that I collect. And I've categorized it broadly in themes. Of course, being in South Africa, politics is a sort of constant microwave background to everything that we do. Whether artists work in a political way or against it, I think politics is always there, and that obviously makes a strong theme in the collection. One of the works to me that illustrates it best is this little sculpture by William Kentridge, The Nose 2, Walking. So as you might know, that he developed a whole body of work together with the production of the opera of The Nose by Shostakovich. And that, of course, comes from the original short story by Nikolai Gogol. And what it's all about is about a civil servant who wakes up one morning and realizes that his nose is gone, and then he runs around outside looking for his nose, and eventually finds his nose and finds that the nose now has a higher rank in the civil service than he has. And the way that William explains is that it's all about the divide itself, but he also put a lot of references to the Stalinist era in this body of work, and how the Communist Party fell apart at the time. And if you look at the date there, I think what's interesting about it is that it was also made at the time when the ANC was experiencing a whole lot of political turmoil. It's at the time when Mbeki was effectively kicked out as president, Julius Malema's rise, the nose taking on a higher rank than his master, all those sort of things I think one can interpret in this very simple sculpture of a nose on two legs. I like photography. This photograph is from 1983 that David Goldblatt took of the Strand with racially segregated areas. You can't see it properly, but it's whites to the left and non-whites to the right. And it's interesting when you look at his body of work, of course, how in 2002 we arrive at this scene in Breer Street in South Africa. And I think it's also significant that it moved to color over that period. I like this quote from an art advisor. Contemporary art usually confronts you with what you don't know, what you didn't know, or what you know in a way that you didn't expect. I think one good illustration of that is Stephen Cohen's chandelier work. I mean, what he did here is to dress in a ridiculous outfit of a chandelier, and then went and walked around in an informal settlement. And I think in that way, we all know that there's inequalities in South Africa. But by doing this, he just highlights the extent of the inequalities in such a graphic way. And I think that to me was a very striking work when I first saw the video. There's also an artist from Burundi, Serge Nitigeka. His art also references a lot of constructivist art and the early communist type of art. You'll see the ball in the middle there is basically a reference to Rodchenko. But this art is really also saying about how politics can capture people. It's all about containment and people being captured within politics and not being able to escape. And that also ties up with his personal history. There's Nicholas Schlobo. His identity politics is far more about sexuality. He uses rubber and ribbon in his sculptures, and in that way makes a political statement about being a gay black man. There's this work by Mikhail Subotsky, which what he did there is to take a decade apart each of the who's who in South Africa, took pictures of the people within it, reproduced the pictures but without any context. So when you see the work and when you look at it, it goes from 1901 on the left-hand side to 1911, 1921, 1931. And as you flip through the pictures, it's just very interesting to see how long does it take for the first women to arrive in the who's who, and then how long does it take for the first non-white to arrive. This work by Candice Braitz, one of my favorite video works. She interviewed twins. These two sisters are lesbian, and it highlights the nature versus nurture debate, I think, very graphically. She asked them to dress in the same way, asked them the same questions, but interviewed them separately. And then obviously when she puts the two next to each other, you can see how much they're the same and how much they're different. And I just love that work for the very effective way in which it identifies gender politics. Of course, talking about that, Zanele Meholi is making a real name for herself with these issues and highlighting the plight of lesbian women in South Africa. This work by Michael McGarry is a tiny work made out of ivory, and it's in the context of the body of work, all talking about the exploitation of resources of Africa. So again, taking a different angle on the politics as well. I do also enjoy abstraction. I think abstraction is obviously very different. It's not really about politics. So this work by Sander Blom, I think, is a fantastic painting. I haven't really seen paintings like this anywhere else in the world. And I think with abstraction particularly, I like this quote, that art has nothing to offer people who are deprived of curiosity for the unknown. I think one has to sort of look beyond just the physicality of the painting or the abstract art and think about maybe it's representing something beyond that, something of the unknown. So this work by Dineo Bopapy, I think, illustrates that well. It's called But Tell Me, Can You Dispossess a Void? What it really means, I don't know. Dineo doesn't want to tell me, so, but I think it is abstract and it does make one wonder, and I think the title certainly makes one wonder as well. This is Wim Botha, using only straight lines to draw an infinity sign, which I thought was a very neat sort of abstract concept. I do like conceptual art as well, and of course, when one talks about conceptual art, you have to talk about Willem Boshoff. This work of his has quotes about capitalism behind it. I do live in Pretoria, so some of the non-art world people, when they see this work, they make different conclusions about what it means, but I'm not a bull supporter. Fishy Tools was one of his early works. He made this at the time of going through a divorce, a particularly difficult time of his life, and you can see that in some of those steel sculptures, there's references to torture, certainly, and also to sexuality. This is one of my non-South African pieces, but I love Joseph Beuys. And that obviously perfectly encapsulates his sort of philosophy about art, that art equals capital in many different ways. The piece by Simon Gush, which a lot of people who visit my home find really hard to understand. It's just a piece of pavement. If you look carefully, there's a spanner embedded in the pavement. And this was all about a show all about workers and labor politics and commenting on that. I do also, beyond the very rational sort of conceptual type of art or abstract art, some of the pieces in my collection, I think, refer more to dreams and disturbing dreams, if I can call it that. So this piece by Deborah Poynton is 2.5 by 2 meters. It is a painting of a garden, but when you look at it, there's no horizon. The perspective is slightly out, and it's sort of a type of garden that I think you would see in a dream. It's almost overwhelming, and I find it quite a disturbing painting, as many of the other paintings are as well. This piece by Penny Siopis, I think, is a wonderful painting. It tells a bit of a story, but it's unclear, and it's clearly not. It's sort of a nightmare, I think, if you look at it, both in terms of the colors and also the physical sort of figures in there. I really enjoy Kemang Waluelere's works. This is just part of it. It's a 21-part drawing, Dog Sleep Manifesto. His work crosses into performance a lot, and in his drawings he highlights that as well. This tiny painting by Carla Besattel, I think, has a lovely title. He only went with your mother because she is so earthy. But it's 10 by 12 centimeters, and I think there's also something quite disturbing about it, and particularly because it is so small. I do enjoy Dineo Bopapy's work. I think this 3-screen installation is very much an immersive experience when one watches it, but also the meaning of it is quite unclear. And a lot of people who visit my home, when they watch it, find it very disturbing in terms of both the imagery and the soundtrack. And I think in the end, art is really about our existential adventure. It's about why we are here and what the meaning of it possibly could be. I really enjoy this work by Gerard Marx, Scion, which the word itself means both descendant and twig. And he built it originally out of actual twigs that he collected from his garden. Then he casted them in bronze, 271 of them. This work by Wim Botha also obviously makes one think about your existence and your mortality. And I think getting back to photography, I like this quote by Philip Dorker de Courcelles. He says, "The world is too elusive to pin down in photograph. The image has to create its own world, hopefully self-contained, an analog of reality, but not a mirror of it. Issues raised by the images are part of their content, and that there should be more questions than answers should surprise no one." So there's one photographer in particular, I think, which raises these issues with his photographs, and that's Peter Hugo. This photograph of the hyena men in Nigeria, I think, was both lauded and criticized a lot at the time when it was taken and published. And he's also taken photographs of Nollywood. But I find his photographs really interesting just because they raise so many issues when you look at them and consider them. And then I'd like to end off with a quick quote, which I think is really meaningful. Art is the playground where the desire for becoming more human than the world can account for at present continues to be tried on for size. Thank you.
Thanks, Emil. It's for sharing your collection with us. Really impressive and some very interesting ideas there. So thank you so much. We can pick up on some of those later on. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Somali Kayingi. Somali is a director at Deutsche Bank. A lawyer by training, she began her career in Sydney before moving to London in 2005, having been recruited by the international law firm Clifford Chance. In 2010, in her capacity as the global coordinator of the Clifford Chance Africa practice, Somali curated her first exhibition of contemporary African art. This marked her first active promotion of contemporary art from Africa and its diaspora, and she began collecting soon after. Somali is currently a trustee of the Triangle Arts Trust, which is an international arts charity, 32 Degrees East, which is a Ugandan arts charity, and she also sits on the Tate Modern's African Art Acquisitions Committee. She's a regular consultant on Africa-related art projects, and she tells me that she aspires to be a proper collector when she grows up. So Somali, tell us how that's working out for you.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you very much to the Goethe Institute and Art Logic for organizing this. But actually, if I'm honest, more than excited, I'm a little bit overwhelmed to share this panel with such extraordinary collectors. By comparison, I'm a bit of an amateur. My collection is quite modest, but my passion for contemporary African art is huge. So rather than talk you through my collection, what I'd like to do is share how I started collecting and how I approach collecting, and perhaps inspire some of those of you in the audience who aren't collectors to maybe give it some thought. Can I actually have a quick show of hands who does collect in the audience? Great, wow. And who is yet to collect? Fantastic. Okay, that gives me an idea. I actually need the buzzer for the presentation. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay. Does it work? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the art scene around contemporary African art. Because in my view, it's actually a really interesting time to collect contemporary African art at the moment. The idea of Africa at the moment is hot. It's sizzling, it's on fire. And when I say the idea of Africa, it's the fact that in the media we see the economic development, the political developments, and this translates also into the interests in the art. And yesterday, if you're fortunate enough to be here, there was a discussion about what it means to be African or what it means to be an African artist. And that's why I like the concept of the idea of Africa, because really that is what we are working with. The continent is huge. It's quite diverse, both within countries and across the continent. But there are themes that resonate, cultural themes, historical themes, and spiritual themes. And so it's that idea of Africa that I feel quite recently is getting a lot of positive traction. And one of the collectors on the panel yesterday, a Canadian collector, Kenneth Montagu, talked about the fact that Africa is a state of mind. So when we look at the concept of African art, what we're looking at is broader than whether or not somebody's parents were born on the continent or whether they were born on the continent, but really this idea of Africa. So in my view, it's a very exciting time, particularly because there is this added awareness. So Africa, the next big thing. And in my work as part of the TAKE committee, it's been quite exciting to see how international institutions are actually taking more notice about what's happening around art on the continent, and also the interest from international collectors. But one of my secret passions actually is to get more people on the continent collecting African art, more Africans collecting African art. Because as Emile has just shown us, there is an amazing, diverse range of strong art being produced on the continent. And for me, art, yes, is about the aesthetics, but more than that, I feel that art as a cultural tool is so important in human development, and it's something that we can't ignore. So this is just, oh, by the way, my pictures, these aren't in my collection, I wish they were. But what I've tried to do is just get an interesting selection of pictures that covers, I guess, the spectrum of what's happening in the art world at the moment. And when we were talking about the fact that, Africa is hot at the moment, this picture is one of Ellen Atsui's bottle cap tapestries, which in 2012 went to auction for £500,000. So it shows you that people are standing up and taking notice of art on the continent. This is just another picture of a well-known artist, Yinka Shonibare, who recently was admitted into the Royal Academy of Arts in the UK. Okay, another picture by Yinka Shonibare. This is a picture by Peterson Kamwathi. This is, interestingly, the first artist I collected. He's from Kenya, a young artist who mainly works in woodcuts. Okay, I'll keep talking and keep that picture up there. Actually, I should explain that. That's a picture by Godfrey Donkor, another artist I collect. He is from Ghana and based in London and works a lot in collage. And so with this image, he's talking about the fact that the way we perceive African beauty, African culture in various media, and almost switching it on its head by using a historical photograph and putting it on the cover of Vogue. Okay, so I probably will go on and just say a little bit about me. I was born in Uganda, but I grew up mainly in Australia, which was quite interesting during the 1980s. So identity crises for me were a daily event, though I have no visible scars. And for me, that's actually one of the main reasons I got into art. Art for me was a way of trying to understand who I was and trying to understand my world. In Australia, I didn't come across African art, to be honest. The closest I got was Picasso. But I guess that's the beauty about art. It's not necessarily about where the artists are from. There still are these universal themes that can resonate through the art. It was really when I moved to London that I came across African art properly, and that was during the Africa Remix show, and it just blew my mind. It was an amazing show showing, in my view at the time, what was the best contemporary African art across the continent. And it was from that point that I really started seeking out African art, going to galleries and going to events. Before I move on to the next slide, I'll just go back to this slide, which shows some ceramics by Magdalene Odundo. She's a Kenyan artist. And the reason I particularly like these is that she did a lot of research on the continent about traditional ceramic methods. And these in particular, the one in the middle and the one to the right, reflect traditional ways of making ceramics from Uganda, which is where I'm from, and that resonates quite a lot with me. Okay. So I get to London, I start going to galleries, but I'm just a gallery goer. I'm just interested in seeing what's out there. And as was mentioned before, I'm a lawyer by training, a finance lawyer, and I also coordinated the Africa group for my firm. Now, when we were launching that group, we decided to hold a client event, and because I liked art, I thought, let's do an art exhibition. So I collaborated with the gallery, and we got about 9 contemporary African artists, some based on the continent, some based outside, and put on an event. And it was actually a fantastic event. We had 150 people come through on the first night, and over the 3 weeks that it was on show, we had people from various galleries and museums come through. So this is the invitation flyer, and you'll see a lot of familiar South African art that was exhibited during that exhibition. We've got some Michael McGarry there as well. An interesting artist, Dina Chanel Abney. And let me talk a little bit about that piece, because it's quite small, but it's quite cartoonish, and you've got human figures with animal heads, and it's quite dramatic. And it was the piece that got the most attention at the exhibition. People didn't like it. People didn't think it was African, and we had a lot of conversation around it. And for me, that was a signal of the success of the exhibition, because it engaged people, it got people talking, discussing, disagreeing with each other about what is African art. And I remember after the exhibition, I got an email saying, well done for the fair from the managing partner, for the exhibition from the managing partner. But he also said, next year, could the art be less challenging? And I thought, great, good result. So it was from that exhibition that I got involved with the Triangle Arts Trust, which runs the Gasworks space in London. And what they are is an international arts charity that supports emerging and middle career artists by giving them the opportunity to do residencies in London, and they also do workshops in country. So that's across Africa. They've done some in Uganda, Nigeria. They're affiliated with the Bag Factory here in South Africa, Zimbabwe, but also in Australia, in India, in South America. So they do a lot with helping artists develop their practice. And it was really when I got involved with Gasworks that I started thinking about collecting, because it was with Gasworks that I started actually interacting with artists. And as Emile said, you need to immerse yourself and think about things and research and read around the art that you are thinking of buying. And so it was really at Gasworks that I began to meet such artists and was interested in buying. And just a quick plug to Gasworks. For the collectors in the audience, they are having an auction in October to raise money to buy the building that you just saw. And in that auction, they've got a beautiful piece by Lynette Yiadom Boache, who interestingly had her first ever exhibition at Gasworks, and her first solo exhibition at Gasworks. And this year she's up for the Turner Prize. So that's the sort of investment Gasworks gives, or it invests in artists to take them from, say, an emerging level to really a mid-career established level. This is, I guess we're moving into sort of how I buy, and I guess sharing a bit about that. This is me at a gallery in London looking at the first piece of art I ever bought. The gallerist actually managed to get a picture. I don't know how he did, but he sent it to me. And this is actually one of Peterson Kamathi's work, which is quite interesting for me because it's a woodcut. It's hard to see it here, but essentially it's a woodcut, and then he paints over it and he produces prints over prints from that woodcut. And as a lawyer, it was quite interesting for me because each of the lines that you see actually form ballot boxes. It's hard to see from here. And then you can see figures. So you can see 5 figures in a line lining up to vote. And that was actually around the time of the Kenya elections where they actually had quite a lot of trouble. And so that was his take on that, which I found quite interesting as an East African and as a lawyer. The rest of the pictures I won't really explain. I'll just flick through them and just keep talking. But essentially, one of the things that I'd say in terms of how I go about buying is that I see a lot of art. I go to a lot of art fairs, I visit a lot of galleries, I go to a lot of museums. And while, as I said at the beginning, my collection is modest, but the more I see, the better I feel my eye for seeing the art becomes. Because when I look at a collection, or at least my collection, you're in a sense curating for yourself, and the central theme is what is important to you. And for me, I think I've established the things that are important for me are identity, justice, and beauty. And so those are the things that when I go to fairs and museums that I tend to look for. And I find fairs like this absolutely amazing because it really exposes you to a whole lot of galleries with really not much effort. Everything comes to you and you have the ability to wander around, take it in, and actually think about things, take them away, and then maybe go back to a gallery to purchase something. The other thing I'd say, for those of you who haven't started collecting, one thing that I found quite useful was to start collecting on paper, because it's far more affordable. My income is not huge, but that's, for me, is not a barrier to collecting. There's actually a lot of art there that is quite affordable, and I found that starting through photography and collecting works on paper was actually quite helpful. And I think I'll round it up here, but I'd say last but not least, buy what you love. Because, I mean, there's a lot of talk about art as an investment, and I think if you choose good art, however you define it, hopefully it will be valuable. But as was discussed yesterday in one of the panels, you need to live with the art. So it's really important that you love the art and that it speaks to you. So these are photographs. This is unfortunately not the best photograph, but I went to Lagos earlier this year, and this was a young female artist who I quite liked. The title of the work is called Nigerianisms, and she's really taken, I guess, Nigerian pidgin sayings and put them in a form of artwork, and I found them quite intriguing. And there's another one there. And this is a picture from a young Ugandan artist, Ronek Ashimbwe. And again, artists like this really excite me. You know, they're not in museums, but I can see their practice developing. And that's me.
Thanks, Marley. Thanks for sharing your insights with us and your collection, which looks pretty grown up to me. Really interesting. Some lovely points that you made that I think we can return to. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the third collector in the session. If I can just find my notes here. Oban Sukbe is also a lawyer and a part-time judge based in London and Lagos. He's a founder member of the British Nigeria Law Forum and the Central Association of Nigerians in the UK. He's a collector with what he describes as, and I quote here, a somewhat haphazard collection of art. The main discernible anchor of which is African art, augmented by works from the UK, Europe, Australia, and the Caribbean. The collection is united, he writes, by what he calls the freedom and intrigue of colour. He's also a member of the Tate African Art Acquisitions Committee and a trustee of the Africa Centre. Oba, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I speak, I should thank those who invited me, otherwise I won't be invited back. So Katharina, Leanne, and Cara have been taking such good care of me. All of you from the Goethe Institute, I hope I see you again next year. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Oba, as you've heard. I'm a lawyer by day. I won't tell you what I do by night, but it has a lot to do with art. And I really want to divide my talk in three by talking about how I became a collector. Secondly, by talking about the Lagos art scene. And I think really by ending with a question, a rhetorical question from what I've observed being in South Africa, and I've been a few times now, and that is, where are all the black African collectors? And I want to examine that question briefly because I would like to stress the importance of having many more black African collectors. But the word collector, I suppose in a way, alienates you because I never thought of myself as a collector. It's more like it's sort of an abstract thing when someone says the collector. I mean, I think a better description for me is an addict. I'm an art addict, and I'm incurably addicted to buying art, and I only check how much I've spent at the end of the year when it's far too late to get the money back. So I'm an art addict, and I want to say that I had the pleasure of seeing Emil's collection. I think it was yesterday, I've lost track of time. And in particular, the piece by Simon Gush, which was the pavement piece. Now, if he hadn't told me that was a piece of art, I would have offered to help him take it to the refuse dump down the corner. So that to me actually tells you so much about where art is going, the imagination of art and its collectors, and seeing his collection. I mean, that's why I refuse to describe myself as a collector, and seeing how he's presented his work, he's a pro, and I am certainly not that. Now, how did I get into collecting? Well, you know how you spend a lot of your early years trying to stay as far away from your parents as possible. I mean, that was me growing up in Zambia and in Nigeria. I would do my best to avoid my father because I had nothing of any sense to say, and he knew it, I knew it. So whenever I saw him, I'd basically try and be invisible. But as you grow older, you spend much more time trying to be like your parents. And that's exactly what's happened to me. I've regressed fatally to trying to be like my father. My father was an anthropologist. His specialist topic was the history of African man. He was a professor, and he was absolutely passionate about the history of African people. What were their civilizations? What were their traditions? What were their norms? What did they do at a daily basis? What did they collect? What did they make? And I spent many years ignoring that as a young man, and I would see what he would put on the walls. I would dismiss it and think to myself, well, I can draw that. What's that? But as I say, that's radically changed. So, if I can operate this, what happened was, in my early 20s, of course, only a couple of years ago, I started to look at some of the art he collected. And I'm sorry about the picture, but this is a painting by a famous artist called Yusuf Grillo. I don't know whether any of you have heard of him in South Africa, but he comes from the Zaria Art School, and he paints traditional African subjects. This is called the Yoruba Bride. And what he does is he paints in soft tie-dye, what we call adire cloth, which are lilacs, they're light blues, they're soft yellows, pinks. So he replicates the beauty of women, African women, how they dress. And this is a woman about to get married that he draws. And if you note the way he draws, he spent some time in England. He was at Cambridge. He spent some time in Berlin. And you can see from his influences the sort of straight lines. If you look at the symmetry, he elongates his figures. Even the head wrap is almost done in an angular way. And he has this way of depicting figures with such poise. So for me, this is called Jesus on a Bike. And you can see there the blues and the soft purples, the greens, his use of color. For those of you who have seen The Scream, this is the African version of The Scream by Yusuf Grillo. I say that slightly ironically because it's difficult to ascertain who influenced who. I would argue that Yusuf Grillo influenced Gabriel Munz, but I'm sure those of you would argue back. But I started to collect him, and I have quite a few of his works now because, basically because I remember seeing on my father's wall. And the Zaria School of Artists at that time were people like Simon Okeke, Uche Okeke, Demas Nwoko, and of course Yusuf Grillo. What they started to do was they started to establish a sense of African pride in what they depicted. Although they had Western influences, they were painting African forms in a deconstructive way, less personal way, which I found extremely exciting. So Yusuf Grillo is a painter that I like. Another one that I like, and I have to tell you, my presentation ends quite shortly because I relied upon Somali, who helped me out by downloading some pictures for me, because I'm such a haphazard collector that I don't even actually know what I've got. And I haven't even photographed what I got, unlike him here. But I know that there's quite a bit. But Ben Osagi is part of the new generation of painters. I would call him a social chronicler of our times. So this picture here is called Prayer Warriors. I have a few of his paintings. I have Prayer Warriors 2. This is Prayer Warriors 1. And it really shows how as Nigerians, we like to pray. And in a way, it is a satire of too much prayer and too much inaction. It's almost as if a prayer will be a solution to everything. That's why he calls it Prayer Warriors. And if you see Prayer Warriors 2, it almost comes alive, where you have literally the painting is as if, you know how we pray as if we're possessed, like this. The painting almost comes alive with prayer, the Prayer Warriors of Ben Osagi. So he paints in a way that his forms are often separated from each other. You'll quite often see a head in the corner, a hand in the left-hand corner, and what he's trying to depict is, in a sense, the decomposition of society in Nigeria, the fabric, the civil society coming apart, the disorganization, the chaos, whilst at the same time you have the richness of color, the depth, the life, the variety. So he has deep reds and deep greens in his paintings. In terms of my own collection, this is also a Ben Osagi. This one I think is called Job Application. But in terms of my other works, I think for me, and talking about the Nigerian scene, the Lagos scene in particular, what strikes me in terms of the differences, and I know there are lots of reasons for it, and it's something that I would like to explore, is the number of indigenous collectors supporting indigenous art in Lagos. There's something like 80, 90 serious collectors. When I say serious collectors, probably the most serious, someone called Yemi Shilon, he has about 7,000 works in his collection. Literally, as you walk through the gate, you're tripping over art. And from him downwards, the collectors are passionate, they're very serious, and they're pretty self-sufficient. They're very aware of what's going on internationally, but they choose to support the local arts, and they buy in numbers. They establish relationships with the artists. And I think that it's such a healthy thing. I think where obviously it's lacking is I haven't seen anybody bequeath their collections yet. I haven't seen the level of organization that I've seen with some of the collectors here who have a curatorial feel about their collection, approach their collection. There are very few in Lagos that I think are at that level. But in terms of numbers, in terms of support, it's almost like a nationalistic thing. There's a real awareness that the artists will thrive if they're collected by their own, effectively their own people. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about are the new forms of art that you're seeing in Nigeria, and new forms of art that I'm collecting. I'm a recent convert to photography. In particular, there's a photographer called Abraham Osagbesi. I don't know whether you've heard of him, but Abraham, he uses his own body as a concept against his own environment. And it's a very sensitive, very intimate way of depicting himself. So some of the pictures you'll see, he also spent some time in Germany. Some of the pictures you'll see is almost as if he's suspended from the air against a wall. There's one photograph in particular which is called Piano Lessons. So he takes a photograph of himself against the wall in Lagos, and on the wall is a mobile number. And what he's saying is that this is do-it-yourself entrepreneurialism. So painted on a wall is a telephone number for someone to take for piano lessons in a very, very base, crude way, but in a way that works. So he's there pretending to play the piano in almost a performance-like way, suspended, and he's obscuring part of the telephone number. In another series that he did in Germany, he was exploring cultural differences between Africans and Europeans. So I think a sense of isolation, lack of communication at times. So one photograph in particular, he's in a subway with a woman next to him, an elderly white woman. He's looking one way and she's looking the other way. And I find that picture very, very striking because I think it talks about his sense of isolation at that time. He spent more time in Germany, he kept going back, and I think the pictures that he started to take depicted a growing sense of comfort. So in Lagos, you're seeing an explosion of other means of art, other means of identification in terms of visual arts. It's not just photography, it's performance art as well. Last year or the year before, we had Lagos Live, which I think the Gotha took part in. It was the first performance art festival in Lagos. Of course, you all know about Lagos Photo, which is a festival of photography. And quite recently, there was an exhibition by Lucy Azubike, and she exhibited with Zanele, who you all know and are very familiar with, Zanele Muhole. And the exhibition was called Like a Virgin. And that exhibition explored issues of gender and sexuality, lesbianism, homosexuality. And that was at the CCA Galleries, which is quite a new gallery in Lagos, deliberately sited away from where most of the galleries are. And the exhibition itself caused a furore in Lagos, because you can imagine a fairly conservative art world confronting those sorts of issues as these photographers did, and the debate, enlivened debates. But that's just the kind of thing that artists do, and that's just the kind of thing that they should be encouraged to do, to basically hold up mirrors to all of us and for us to look at this sort of society we're in. And that, I suppose, is what contemporary art is about, and that's why I find contemporary art increasingly exciting. As a means of survival in Lagos, you have the established collectors, you have the expatriate collectors, then you have the emerging collectors, who are a younger generation of global collectors. So you'll see them at art fairs in London, you'll see them at Basel, you'll see them in New York, I mean, a recent art fair I was at in London at Bonhams, it was a contemporary African art fair, but Nigerians flew in from Lagos. There were about 15 Nigerians in the room from Lagos. And that was very exciting for me. And at that exhibition, a well-known Nigerian artist called Ben Nwanwu, he reached figures of £370,000 for some of his figures. And of course, it probably doesn't compare with people like Gerald Sokoto or Irma Stern, but those were exciting figures for us. And when I think back to my father, who collected Ben Nwanwu, and he collected Ben Nwanwu when he used to pay £200 or £300, I'm sure he'd be staring in his grave now at the prices that some of these artists are going for. So let me end with the rhetorical question that I wanted to pose to myself and pose to you about the absence of black African collectors. There's one gallery owner who's in the audience. I think he's somewhere. I won't name him, but he was telling me that yesterday he's been selling art for about 15 years. And yesterday, for the first time, a black collector bought some art from him. And he was so enthused that he took a picture of the purchaser. So there are serious questions, I think, and I think because I'm Nigerian, I'm allowed to ask controversial, serious questions when I'm not in Nigeria. There's some serious questions to ask and to answer about the absence of black African collectors. And it's so important that they get involved, because some of the artists you're seeing in this fair, some of the artists you're seeing on the continent, very soon they will be well out of anybody's purchasing power, let alone the black African collector. And I think for the artists as being chroniclers of daily life, which is inclusive, it depicts everybody. It's a message to everybody, it's a message from everybody. It's so important that that message is accepted and I think imbibed by everybody. So I'm sure you'll be able to tell me the answers, but coming from the background that I do, where I see almost a nationalistic fervor about trying to get our art back, it's something that I really want answered. And I guess I should end with my father, because he was my inspiration for collecting. When he spent time in the UK, he worked at the British Museum for about 8 years. And he used to write the histories to a lot of the works that were in the vaults. And the day he stopped working for the British Museum was the day he was tempted to help himself to some of the artifacts that belonged to Nigeria, some of the Benin bronzes that were elsewhere, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to stop putting them in his pocket and taking them back to Lagos. So he resigned at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oba. Thanks for sharing those insights with us. Again, I think some interesting and important ideas that we can pick up on in the discussion. So, my pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Warren Siebrits, very well known to many of us in Johannesburg and in South African art world. Warren started his career in the South African art world in 1989 at the original Stefan Weltzen company. From 1992, he worked at the first dedicated contemporary art gallery in South Africa. That was the Everard Reed Contemporary, which closed in 1995. He then began his career as an art advisor, and during this time worked on two prominent and important collections, the Gauteng Legisla collection and also the BHP Billiton, or GenCore collection as it was known then. In 2001, he curated aspects of South African Art 1 with Hans Bormann, and subsequent to that opened his own gallery here in Johannesburg, Warren Siebrits Modern and Contemporary Art. He operated that gallery until 2009, and since then he's been working as a private dealer and also focusing a lot more on his own collecting.
So many things to say in a short space of time, but I think one advantage that I've had sort of quite literally is that I've worn so many different hats over the last 20 years in the art world. I think it was very important for me particularly to have started working in the auction business. More technical way of thinking of the auction business is it's also referred to in market terms as the tertiary market, which means it's the third stage in development of how a market evolves. And I think this is something I'll just touch on very briefly before I begin my presentation, because this is where I've been thinking about this concept for years, this evolution of consciousness. And although materially, all the art that's produced throughout the centuries and currently will obviously survive if it's looked after and loved, even if it's only by a number of people, there are very, very few artists in history who evolve through consciousness to become known, most importantly, at a future time, by future generations. So although my wife and I, we've always been keen collectors, also, to coin a phrase, collect quite haphazardly, and we have quite a large collection. It must be maybe 200 items or so. I would say that there are only a handful of items in that collection, even though I'm very well aware of all of these things and concepts that probably fall into that category of the evolution of consciousness, artworks that are probably going to remain great in the future, in 100 years' time. So really, although it's a very controversial theme in the art world, in any art world, I'm going to speak about hierarchies today in the art world. I don't necessarily agree with these hierarchies. I think that my other great advantage, sort of having my historical and sort of auction background at Sotheby's, is the fact that I've looked very keenly at history. And I've looked, particularly in the last 50 years, I've looked at the South African art market as well as the international art market. And a lot of the sort of the 10 slides or so that I'm going to talk about are gleaned from my sort of breakthroughs in understanding that history. Okay, this will probably look like a really unusual slide to see for an art presentation, because quite literally, as I've titled there, what do Usain Bolt and collecting art have in common? Well, absolutely nothing. But I think the concepts that are important here are the concepts of first and last. And obviously someone like Usain Bolt is world-renowned and world-famous. He's probably almost never lost a race in his life. He's always come first. But in the consciousness of collecting, and a lot of other things in life, it's not necessarily about getting to something first. It's about making a decision in the course of time that will have a lasting impact, not just today and not just in 10 years' time, but inside that future generation. So something, in fact, sort of inspired me in Emile Stipp's presentation. We've also got sort of similar works in our collection, not by Wim Botha, but by Michael McGarry. We've got a work that has a skull. And clearly, when you own a work like that, as Emile mentioned, you think about the concepts of mortality and immortality, even subliminally, every single day. And that's something that's always puzzled me in the art world, because I truly do love all art that is made, and I don't mean to sound wishy-washy in saying that. You get to meet artists who create wonderful work, and I mean, there's just such great inspiration and such great context behind all of these fantastic works. But as you'll see with my presentation, so few artists actually make it in that evolution of consciousness. In professional terms, I'm talking professional artists. In the next generation and beyond, 1 out of 100 artists actually make it into that next sort of sphere of discussion. Sorry. Oh, great. Oh, thanks. My wife and I were overseas recently. I have to admit, the first time I've been to the Venice Biennale, but I must say that I think I couldn't have been introduced to a better Biennale for what I saw there, and it was truly inspirational. But part of the trip also involved going to see other museums, obviously, into other parts of Europe. And my wife booked a very beautiful little apartment. She did it on purpose because she knows I'm a huge admirer of Peggy Guggenheim. So our apartment that we stayed in for 10 days was literally 200 paces from the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. And what's important here is how this sort of concept links, because we were in Venice first, then to go to Hanover. Now you think that's a very unusual place to go to. It's a smallish city in Germany, not particularly well known as a tourist destination. But I, for one, am a huge fan of Kurt Schwitters and always have been for at least 25 years. For those of you who don't know who Kurt Schwitters was, he was a very important founding sort of philosopher and member of Dada. and he was based in Hanover. He was also despised by most of the Dadaists because he actually was bourgeois. I mean, he was quite a wealthy man who inherited property, he had revenues. In one of these properties, it became a famous work which one can view the replica of in the Museum of Modern Art. He actually built this fantastical and crazy thing called a Merzbau, which is literally a building that enclosed all these little secrets and little objets and little mementos that he collected over the years, and would literally build them close sometimes. And eventually, and he was quite a capitalist, let me tell you, he was quite money conscious. He actually took the decision to break through the roof. They had a double-story home, and he kicked the tenant out to actually let the Merzbau continue. And then unfortunately, during the war, I mean, Hanover is one of the main manufacturing centers in Europe. It was flattened by the RAF. As a result, the Merzbau, that's why there's a replica in the Museum of Modern Art. It doesn't exist anymore. But I really wanted to go and see this exhibition. And there's a linking factor in this photograph. You've got Peggy Guggenheim sitting on the left, but there's a man that links both Peggy Guggenheim, hence him being in the photograph with her, and then Kurt Schwitters, and his name is Sir Herbert Reed. He was one of the great visionaries in England, great champion of modernist painting. I mean, not just inside England, but he understood it very well coming from Europe. He's a champion of all those early modernist painters, and particularly Kurt Schwitters. Kurt Schwitters really despised, of course, the Nazis and what they did, not just to his art, but just their general views, on culture and everything else. And he was persona non grata, and he had to flee for his life, and he literally escaped via Norway, landing in Scotland, and was then interned. And he was interned, I think, for a year or two, and eventually released in the early 40s. And it was Sir Herbert Reed that actually opened his first English art exhibition. And he said something very profound, which I saw in original form in the, in the museum, in the context of the show. And he said that time marches on, and war and peace take their turns in the life of nations, and generations are born, and generations pass away, but art lasts. And this was probably the lasting, not to create a pun here, but this was my lasting impression of the whole of my trip to Europe. I mean, I've got great memories of going to Peggy Guggenheim's home and to see that collection. I went 3 times. I have great memories of lasting impressions of the Venice Biennale. But I have such great insights, to Kurt Schwitters, and also just to how do you, as a collector, someone like Peggy Guggenheim, how do you create a vision that will actually be lasting and be relevant to people in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time? Now, I'm glad this painting is quite small because there are 30, and you probably won't be able to see the names underneath all the various birds, but there are 30 South African artists, all contemporary artists, quite a number of them I've actually seen here today at one time or another. And according to the Avant-Garde, who don't exist technically anymore, but they were made up at the time of Michael McGarry, Zander Blom, and Jan-Henry Boyens, they named these 30 artists the B Team. And I can tell you something. I closed my gallery very soon after this, but I participated in the first 2 art fairs. So it was the art fair of 2009. One of our artists, and I think I must mention it because it's important for context, his name's Gerard Marx. I'm sure a lot of you know him. He's sitting right up at the top. He's depicted as an owl, and he's very close to Coronel at the top on the left-hand side. I thought the work was actually fantastic. I saw it at What If the World, and I didn't sort of say anything about it. It was right at the beginning of the fair. And he came round the corner and said, geez, have you seen these creeps? He didn't really know who they were. The Avant-Garde, they put me in the B Team. And I was like, well, maybe, I always sort of try and twist everything around. I was like, that's probably not good on one level, but maybe, there's something to it. Maybe if you're not really in the B Team and you know you're better, it's not going to worry you. And if it worries you, you're going to work harder and you're going to try and get into whatever that A Team is. As a result, I actually felt compromised because one of the artists in our stable disliked the work so much, I actually wanted to buy it. And I kept going, like we're sitting here, day 1, day 2, day 3, and it was not being sold. But I couldn't morally bring myself to buy it because I knew I'd have to answer to Gerard. I mean, he was really incensed by this work. The story gets a lot more interesting. I think that's the important thing about being a collector, good, bad, or indifferent. You don't have to be Peggy Guggenheim, and the work doesn't have to last for the next 100 years. But if something sticks in your mind, you should follow it as best you can. And I know that it went to What If the World. They had a big avant-garde specific exhibition about 3 months later, and it was sold. And I was so disappointed. And then it was some artist party, I forget now, in about 2010 up in Johannesburg. And then the guys from What If the World were there, and I happened to mention to them, if the painting ever comes around, I really am keen on this. And I said to Justin, I saw him recently when the fair opened, just thanking him. He must have passed on the message, because the owner got hold of me and said, look, I've got this painting and it's actually been in storage, and I'd really like to sell it. And actually, she was quite a tough negotiator. Maybe I'm not tough enough, so I paid quite a nice price relative to what its asking price was originally. I think that's another thing I must say, is that price also shouldn't become a factor in the end. If you really like something, I know I could have corrected the whole thing by having bought it in the beginning, but when you get offered something really special again, the second time you think it's too expensive, don't make a mistake, just buy it, because you'll never live it down if you let it go again. Anyhow, the price wasn't the issue, and I said, fine, I'll take it. Then I just happened to ask her, and this is a bit of a funny story. It's like, how come the work that you love so much and used to hang on your stairs in a prominent home in Higgovale in Cape Town, how did it end up in storage? And sorry to Zwelethu Mthethwa here, but there's another artist who now gets kind of embroiled in this painting. He's a good friend of hers, and she had invited him round for Sundowners. He's not aware of this painting, or he wasn't aware of the painting at the time at all, and he walked into the house. Well, he went into an apoplectic fit, apparently, to the point where it was like so embarrassing for her. She didn't want to lose a friendship, and she promised him right there and then she'd have the painting taken down and you'd never see it again. So, there's also that chance and luck element that plays a role. And I will continue in this sort of investigation, but the thing with art is, just in its current context or its immediate context, it does last, in the sense that even if you miss something now and you're really disappointed because you weren't maybe right at the top of the VIP list, or you're not an insider, or you only came on Saturday instead of Friday, the work didn't dematerialize. People's fortunes change, so do their minds, in the sense they fall out of love with something, and you should keep a mental note of things. And that's also the lovely thing about the sort of democratic multiple sort of idea with photography and prints and works on paper, is that you can have multiple owners for a particular image, which is also reassuring. But also don't give up on originals, because things really do change hands. And so just always bear that work in mind, and always put your name down with the gallery where it was, and say, well, look, even if it's going to take 15 years, particularly the well-established galleries like Goodman, Michael Stevenson, I'd really like to buy this work if it comes up. And galleries are really professional that way. I've done it often for clients. They will get back to you, and they'll actually honor that pact that they have. Now, this is probably for me one of the most important pieces of philosophy that I've ever sort of seen for myself, and it's deeply ingrained in my personal philosophy of how I view art and collecting. It was part of an essay given, or part of a talk actually given by Marcel Duchamp in Houston in 1963, and the theme was titled The Creative Act. And I could explain it to you, but I prefer to read it because it's so profound. Part of his speech was basically that millions of artists create. Now, bear in mind, when he says millions, that was in 1963, so who knows what the number is today. Only a few thousand are discussed or accepted by the spectator, and many less again are consecrated by posterity. Now, what he was really aiming at is, and he, with Herbert Reed, a lot of people don't know this, was the central art advisor to Penny Guggenheim on all her Picassos, all her Georges Braques, her Giacomettis. He was an extremely brilliant man. A lot of people write off Duchamp because he made objects that still threaten and challenge people, and they can't see the point of them. And that was just his way of doing things. He had a brilliant mind, a great sense of humor, but he was an extremely bright person. And what his whole theory was, and I really see the point in this, he said that the artist is only, doesn't matter how famous they are, doesn't matter what media machine behind them, what they have behind them, or what gallery who represents them, they are only 50% of the creative act. And the other 50% of that creativity is formed by all of us, the viewer. And that is the evolution of consciousness. Things get discussed, of course, in the current, and then they might, if they're really good, get discussed in 3 or 4 years' time. But that's the power of any great artist, is will it continue to be debated and discussed in the future? Now, these are quite striking and difficult examples, but to give an idea, talking about the Venice Biennale, the last time South Africa participated in the Venice Biennale was in 1966, because in 1968 the United Nations declared apartheid a crime against humanity, and that was the end of South Africa till 1993 at the Venice Biennale anyway. And there were 15 artists selected in that year. And I won't run through the names, well, I can very quickly. I mean, they were Kenneth Bakker, Paul du Toit, May Hillhouse, Judith Mason, Cecily Sash, Lawrence Scully, Cecil Scottness, Frank Spears, Helmut Stark, Anna Forster, Gerard Deleu, Solly Dissner, Sidney Kumalu, Michael Zondi, and Eben Leibrandt. Now, just using my knowledge of markets and prices and where things have evolved, in really specific terms, there are only 2 artists out of those 13 today that have truly remained in that evolution, in that real evolution of consciousness in the minds of collectors, according, of course, to their art prices. I mean, these are the 2 artists are Cecil Scottness and Sidney Kumalu, who now command well over 500,000 Rand a work. I'm not saying it's the only criteria for what makes an artist good, but a lot of these artists can't even get 20, 30, and 40,000 Rand for their works today when they were selling them for 500, 600 Rand 30, 40 years ago. Then the same thing applies very quickly with this advert, which was one of the very powerful galleries along with the Goodman. It had actually been established before the Goodman. Goodman was established in '66. They had been going for some time longer. They were called Gallery 101. They took out an advert in November, December 1970 in what was the Art South Africa of yesteryear. It was called Artlook magazine. It ran into 100 issues. And they, as you can see from the byline, they called their advert Leading Contemporary South African Artists. They were such a famous gallery, they didn't even have to put their address or telephone number. They were an institution. Now, to be frank, I'm not going to go through the names, I'm running out of time, but there were 54 artists on this list. The only artists that have made it inside the evolution of consciousness today are Walter Battis, Eric Loubser, Lucas Satoli, Cecil Scottness, and Maurice van Esch. So that's 5 out of 52. 10%. And again, I'm gauging it on, I've got records of what all these artists' major works sold for in 1970. And major works honestly sold for up to 1,000 Rand. And I know what they sell for today, and they haven't even broken even. Now, that's not their fault. The fault is inside the evolution of that evolutionary cycle of consciousness, that somehow there's been a disconnect or the person's been forgotten. But I'll end with these last 2 slides, just to really be a little controversial. As you can see from the title, Warhol in South Africa, 1970. Although Andy Warhol never made it to South Africa, it was one of his great masterpieces. It's that painting of 30 is better than 1, it's titled. It's a huge painting. It's 2.8 meters by 2.1 meters. It hung in a residence in Hyde Park in Johannesburg, and the woman who owned it, her name was at the time, her married name, Mary Harari, had owned it for about 5 years. It was shown at the Pretoria Art Museum in 1969. It took me 10 years to find this catalogue, but here's the proof of it. There's the details on the back. They didn't just have Warhol, they had Rauschenberg, they had Jules Zelitzky, they had Picasso, they had phenomenal masterpieces. Unfortunately, she got divorced in 1970, and because it was in a trust, she had to sell the painting. Now, the painting was sold to the Peter Brand collection. It's a very famous collection of contemporary art in Connecticut. He's one of the big collectors. You can Google him. He's still rated as the most important single acquisition he made. He was actually on honeymoon in the Serengeti. The whole thing was negotiated by a satellite phone. It cost him $20,000. Now, if that sounds like a lot of money, it wasn't, because the Rand in 1970 was stronger than the US dollar. So basically, it was the equivalent of like 25,000 Rand. Now, to provide a counterpoint, probably with the next slide, and although I've worked in the South African art market and I'm very supportive of the South African art market, to me there's a tremendous amount of hype, particularly perpetrated by the auctioneers, around the art and investment potential of South African art. And let me just tell you today, with this example, which will illustrate it very painfully, it's really not such a great investment field. Because in 1971, when Sotheby's Park Bennett had their first auction, which was incidentally at the site of what is now the Wits Art Museum, it used to be a Volvo car showroom, They sold an equivalent painting to the one of the right of PNF, which was the record price achieved at that particular auction. I then gleaned another painting on the right, which I thought was sort of similar in quality, to show two PNFs, and then I'll throw in a Van Gogh, which was then also a record price at the time. It was a little less, it was 7,500 Rand in 1971, to get roughly to that 25,000 Rand mark. Now, if we go back to the Andy Warhol, and this is where I'll finish, two paintings from exactly to as it would happen, from exactly the same year and exactly the same show, have been the highest selling Andy Warhols in the last 4 years at auction internationally. 8 Elvises 1963, sold by private treaty in October 2008, and this is the price back then, was sold for $100,000 in October 2008. And Green Car Crash 1963, sold in May 2007, was sold for $80 million, which equates to R1 billion. You'd be lucky today, not that it's not good profits, but you'd get 25 million Rand, maybe 30, maybe even 35 million Rand for the two PNFs and the Van Gogh versus the 1 billion Rand you would get for the single Warhol. So one thing I just want to end with is what I've been trying to do since I closed the gallery, since I have a lot more resources and I also have a lot more time. The one big mistake I think collectors are making, and I know we all go through it, is that they are too acquisitive and they're buying far too quickly, and they are a little, it becomes a little bit like a drug. And I think that's an evolutionary cycle, but the real success of things in the end is to slow the whole process down. By slowing the process down, you can, let's say you can go from buying 100 things to one thing in a year. You suddenly have your whole year's budget to buy one thing. You spend that long in art and you've read and you've spoken to people, you are knowledgeable. Trust your instincts, trust your eye, and spend bigger sums of money on more important works. They won't just have a more lasting value for you and your friends and your family, but you'll probably end up with a masterpiece that every museum, not just in South Africa, but even maybe around the world, will covet one day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Warren. Very interesting set of ideas and historical information in that presentation. I'm sure we can unpack some of those in discussion. A big thanks to all the panelists. I think it's interesting to see some common trends that have emerged. And I think, it's very nicely summed up this idea of the evolution of consciousness that Warren suggests, because I think it sort of seems to operate on two levels. What has come through very clearly from the collectors on this panel is the evolution of a kind of a personal consciousness. All of them in different ways have spoken about the intense personal investment that the artworks represent to them. I think that, sorry, my notes are in a bit of a jumble. This is the problem with doing things on an iPad and not on paper. I think Emile put it quite nicely, and I'll get there in a moment. Bear with, as Miranda's friend says on the TV show. Bear with. Oh man. Here we go. Okay. Where Emile talks about the way that contemporary sort of confronts you with what you don't know, what you didn't expect, what you didn't know. I think it was a quote from someone. And how that really gets very deep inside your own personal consciousness in a way. And then getting back to Dante's idea about the meaning and embodiment, but the most important component of that is what the viewer brings to it. So in other words, that sort of completes that circle, if you like, the interpretation. And again, that is a trend that's true, that's been common to all these collectors. And of course, it's a staple of post-structuralist thought, this idea that the artwork will always assume meanings and interpretations beyond the intentions of its maker. It's very interesting to see how the different collectors respond to different things in that. Whether it's from the point of view of how these address sort of big themes, important questions in social and political dynamics, and how Emile relates to that, or to Somali, who's
intensely, motivated by a deep personal search for identity and trying to understand her place in the world as someone who had this sort of trans-global identity. For Oba, who was inspired by his father's collection, and again, that, finding within those works an intense kind of personal connection that becomes something bigger. It becomes part of a kind of an identification with the national identity in a way. And then Warren sort of complicating that by showing that, that these things, in the end of the day, notwithstanding one's personal evolution of consciousness, form part of a broader sort of social evolution of consciousness, that they are, in a sense, commodities. I think very sobering set of figures around, well, I think two very sobering things. First, about the kind of relative invisibility of artists who were once considered important enough to be sent to a biennale and who are now, marginal at best, or at worst completely invisible. And second, this idea of the investment value of art, just what a slippery slope that is. So in other words, an evolution of a much bigger kind of consciousness that is, it's a very interesting social construct, this idea of the art market and how, what is that magic that turns something that has no essential intrinsic value into something that can sell for the equivalent of R1 billion. I don't really want to ask any personal questions myself. I think rather open it up to the panel first, if there's anything you'd like to ask of each other. Perhaps you'd like to comment on Warren's rather provocative last point.
Yeah, it was good to hear that Warren's got the antidote for my addiction, which effectively means that I need to inject myself each time I'm about to buy and slow down. I doubt it will work. But I think that because there's a sort of a hunger within yourself, for whatever reason that you're buying art, you're trying to really fill something of a void. And you're constantly exploring and challenging what you've bought and what you've seen and what message it's giving you. It's quite difficult to stop unless you just don't have any money, and then it's much easier to stop. And I don't think you're buying on the basis that this will be worth $1 billion in 20 years, because that to me is 50-50, and I usually get it wrong, so for me it's less than 50-50 odds. But I think you're buying because the art you're looking at gives you an answer of some kind at that particular time. And because it gives you that answer, you want to take that answer home and put that answer in your house, just in case you forget what the answer is.
It's interesting that you mentioned the anecdote is lack of finances. I think I'm in the privileged position of actually collecting very slowly, which I guess is a little bit of a luxury because as I said, I go to a lot of fairs, a lot of galleries, but I essentially buy once a year because of that limitation. So I don't know whether that's more tightly curated or not, but yes, that's how I approach my collection.
I think, on the topic of money and art, it's always hard because people have so many different views as to what is valuable art and what is not, and those things change over time. I think if you really collect art, you probably don't do it as an investment because it's very difficult, as Warren has pointed out, to predict what's going to be important in 30 years' time. I think what is relevant, though, is that to an extent, the collector has some influence over whether artworks enter into the collective consciousness. And particularly if you make your collection available to be exhibited in, public exhibitions, or you promote the artworks, then maybe you can play some small role in at least making those works enter into the collective consciousness. And I see that certainly as a big part of the responsibility of being a collector. But in the end, I guess if 200 years from now, the works that I spend money on now is worthless or completely forgotten. It doesn't really matter to me because I won't be around anymore. But maybe they are. Some of them might enter the consciousness, and that would be very satisfying, but I wouldn't know about it. So.
Thanks, Emil. I think, I think who was it who was saying, was it also Emil who said that, in your interest in conceptual work, that it's the concept in search of an object. And that, of course, is also, I think, speaks very strongly to that notion of the evolution of consciousness and the idea that the viewer or the collector, as you've just said, becomes an important player in terms of the construction of the meaning and to some degree the value. But I think the implicit question for this panel and I suppose for the assembled company here and indeed for the art fair is who constructs the value, and how can one, within the sea of uncertainty that is the market and the art market particularly, still persuade people to kind of, part with sometimes substantial sums of money for things that, again, have no intrinsic value. That's maybe something we can come back to in the open question session. But Oba, I had a particular question for you, and that is, what is your view? You left us with a set of rhetorical questions about the absence of African and black African collectors. Would you like to advance an opinion?
I think there's a dissociation amongst black collectors from the art scene in the sense that many of them don't see it as something for them. They see it as something that people have time to do, have money to do, and in a way it's an intellectual pursuit that in a way is irrelevant to their daily lives. And I think it is in a way, I think a form of, there's a barrier there. And the barrier, whoever put that barrier there, however it's been formed, it's so important to break through that barrier. Now the barrier, it could be a financial barrier, it could be a generational barrier, it could be a snobbery barrier, where those who have the time and the money to buy art make it sound so mysterious and so exclusive that, it's difficult to imagine yourself as being in that buying society or whatever. I think, to be frank, some of it probably deliberate, where you have these lines drawn, and there's still certain parts where they're reserved for certain buyers. So I'm just giving you my honest opinion. I think that I'm just desperate to see a really honest dialogue and almost a campaign to ensure that those barriers aren't there. And black buyers are positively encouraged to buy African art. I mean, in a way, it does need a form of positive discrimination to bridge that gap. Otherwise, it's going to take years for it to happen. And it has to happen a lot quicker, because it seems to me that if it continues like this, in 5-10 years, you'll see small pockets, a few more here and there. I don't think it'll be enough to sustain some of the talent that we're seeing today. And if the talent can't sustain itself, it will either die or it will go overseas to markets that appreciate it in value. So that's my view.
Thanks, all. Right, we have about 25 minutes, so I'd like to open to the floor. Any questions or comments? We've got Tracy, we've got Gordon.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you. I've got two questions. The first one is to Warren. Is it okay if we wean ourselves to one a month before we go to one a year? And the second one is to you, Frederico. Could we please talk about lens-based work and the quite curious situation we have here at the Johannesburg Art Fair, which is full of photography, but there's very few South African collectors who are really invested in photography.
Gordon, can you rephrase that a little, or just what did he say?
Sorry.
No, look, I'm obviously sort of going to extreme ends because I also don't have, people might think I have a lot of money myself. I do form reasonably good budgets because I actually save for very long periods of time to buy one thing. But I think the principle is it's like some kind of strategy. You've got to be trying to find a strategy that's doing the opposite to the status quo, what the herd mentality is doing. 'Cause otherwise, you're going to lose. You're going to get sucked up into where the whole system wants you to go for whatever reason, whether it's media, whether it's the galleries, whatever's constructing it. It's dangerous. You've got to think on the opposite, like the other side of the coin. And so, what people don't realize that if you're a serious collector, and let's say, I'm going to be quite open here. Let's say we're going to all do well and we're going to get to 80. You've got a lot of time in front of you. That's what I've worked out since I closed the gallery. I mean, 3 of those masterpieces that I consider masterpieces, I've bought 1 piece a year roughly since the gallery closed. And I realized, well, geez, I'm only 45 now. If I make 80, I've still got 35 years to go. I don't want that much art. So I'm just using it as an analogy. I mean, collecting's not the sort of thing that, well, in my book, I've been a collector since I was at school collecting records and things. You do it, it's part of who you are. So there's a lot of time ahead of you. And inside that, this thing quickly which I want to touch on is, you will then see if you start looking at markets for 10 and 20 years, those things you coveted in the primary sense come back. They've come back, first of all, maybe you still don't like the price and so on in the secondary market, they get resold to the gallery. And then, unfortunately, people go out of favor. Even Andy Warhol went out of favor. I couldn't get through my presentation, and a lot of people don't know that Charles Saatchi, before the YBAs, I mean, he was one of the most profound modernist collectors in the world, collecting Bacons and, everything you can think of. And one of his major cornerstones of his first gallery, opened in 1995, it was Andy Warhol, a very important one of this caliber, that was under Andy Warhol's bed, apparently waiting for a rainy day. And the reason why he got it, he said it was a lot of money, but it was cheap in the end. So Warhol had gone out of fashion. Warhol constitutes 1/3 of the whole international art market now, the contemporary art market, all by himself. The 1980s, he was dead in the water and out of fashion. So that's the advantage when you're putting the time equation into it and you start watching things over time. There is honestly a trend. There's nothing that's just going like this or nothing that's even just going like that.
Thanks, Ryan. Gordon, I'm going to attempt to answer your question to some extent, but then we're going to ask the panelists to comment too, and it might be helpful, in fact, if Kenneth is willing to comment, since he's a big collector of lens-based work. Sorry, Kenneth, to bring you back into the discussion. I think there are a few things. I think that, the point that you make was that the preponderance of photography in this art fair, despite the fact that there are relatively few South African collectors of photography or lens-based work. I think there are a few things. I mean, obviously, the emergence of the so-called new media, or lens-based work more generally, is, of course, a response to the kind of the world that we inhabit. The ubiquity of technology, the accessibility of technology, the fact that these kinds of technologies are very freely and easily available to a broad base of people. I think that's the one point. I think also that the fact that increasingly we live in such a mediated world, a world that is absolutely saturated with all kinds of media, and a lot of that media is electronic. And I think it's a way of being in the world and a way of engaging with the world that is fundamental to our time. So it's almost inevitable that artists are going to start gravitating towards this kind of new media. Now, I think at best, new markets emerge in response to new media. And this clearly has happened in Europe, in the United States, where there is a substantial and viable market for photography and lens-based work. Less so in the South African context, but I think the South African market has tended to be somewhat reactive. It's tended to lag somewhat behind international markets. I think that events like the Johannesburg Art Fair during the past, how long has it been, 5 or 7 years of 6 years of its existence, has gone a long way to educating the South African market about what's out there and what people are buying and what people are prepared to spend money on. So I think that you know, it's a part of a process. So I think the ubiquity of the photographic work here also reminds us that an event like the Joburg Art Fair attracts collectors and buyers from all over the world. It's not just necessarily geared at South African buyers. So that's what I can offer. I'll open it to my esteemed colleagues on the panel.
I'll just say a little bit about that. I wouldn't say that photography, I mean, there's a lot of lens-based work that is quite new, but I wouldn't say that in the African context photography necessarily is, in that we have had photographers, particularly from Francophone West Africa, who have been around for quite a long time. Malik Sidibe comes to mind. And I think it has grown partly because, I guess, as a medium, photography in particular is quite accessible and in a way quite democratic. Not that all photos produced are good, but that it's an easy medium perhaps to get into. I think the reason why we're not seeing that many collectors, or I guess as you were saying, it's a process where we will see more collectors in the future, is perhaps what Oba alluded to, the fact that we actually need more collectors on the continent, full stop. And I guess when people start collecting, they tend to look at the traditional stuff first. I've been to a few auctions in Lagos, and similar, I guess, to this fair, there was a lot of photography, but it didn't sell. People wanted the traditional paintings, traditional landscapes, and it's an evolutionary process, which I think is in part due to exposure. I think over time that will change. And also the dynamic of people collecting. I think as you get more young people in who are constantly bombarded with this new technology, I think the collecting of lens-based work will increase.
I'd be interested in what Emil has to say about this, actually.
I think I agree that it's an evolution. I think maybe it's also a generational thing. I think younger generations are far more, how should I say, exposed to visual culture from an earlier age in the form of photography and also video-based works. And I think it will probably evolve over time. The one thing that might be a barrier, though, and I think that is important to say in the connection with African art, photography, is that I'm not sure that people always trust that the galleries here would follow professional standards of editioning and not reissuing photographs in different sizes or re-editioning photographs. And I think that is important, because I think it not only stops local collectors, but probably also international collectors from buying more. If you buy a photograph, there's a contract of trust involved, that if the edition is 10, that it will remain 10, and that there won't be a smaller version in 5 years' time of another 20 being issued because of a popular photograph. So I think partly I have seen some situations where there has been an abuse of trust, and I think that makes it harder to stimulate the market in future.
One word of advice I can just give, sort of following up, Emil and I have actually talked about this a lot, is just a guideline that one should think of. If you become quite a serious collector of photography, and I know I've dealt with South African printmaking on quite a serious level, particularly Rorke's Drift and William Kentridge and a number of other artists I know extremely well. And what you've got to think about when you're buying any artwork, but particularly a multiple and a print, you're buying time embedded in materiality. That's the most important thing. And so you've got to get as close to what they call the negative as possible. Every photograph is recorded to have been taken in a certain year. And if you're very serious, you're going to wait. You're actually going to forego things that get offered to you until all the prerequisites of what you're looking for are right. And that's what I would say is, like I said earlier, don't be in a rush to spend your money. You've got to identify precisely what suits you and what it is you're looking for. And it will eventually find you, and you'll be surprised as well at in what kind of context and at what kind of price. But the thing is to rather find a few things that you really admire and follow them, rather than always try and second guess this huge market that, even for professionals like myself, everyone asks me, who's the next Kentridge? Or nobody can tell you. It's confusing out there.
Thanks, Warren. Kenneth, would you like to comment?
I did think a lot about this over the last 3 days at the fair, that issue that you're mentioning about, photography here? Why is it not being purchased here? Why is it so important to us in North America? I'm in Toronto. Contemporary African photography, I think, is also, we have to remember, a matter of taste. And early on in the game, there were some curatorial decisions that were made by the powers that be that heavily influenced what we feel outside of South Africa, what we feel as collectors is the important African photography. And I say that with quotation marks. It's not really a personal feeling of mine, but I can tell you that there was a very important show, 1997, there was a Johannesburg Biennial, Oakley and Wazer, certain artists were introduced. I think just even more significantly in terms of collectors, John Pigozzi, who is a major collector of African art in Europe, he had a curator, Andre Mannion, and that curator kind of discovered certain works, Seydou Keita, Malik Sidibe, Samuel Faso, to name three of the prominent photographers from West Africa. And I think that work, because it was so pushed out into the public consciousness outside of Africa, particularly in America, in England, in France, really moved things forward in an important way, but it also kind of made collectors feel that the work that was important in Africa, is that stuff. And so it's still kind of like a trend that keeps picking up speed. And so interestingly, I think the collectors outside of Africa see the value in it because there's been many years of acquisitions and exhibitions and thought that's gone around it, scholarship and many reviews and literature. So that work makes the collector, the outside of Africa collector, think photography is the thing. And I think that, one of the important things now is to balance that out. And I think that you will see that importance of painting and other media will come along and not just be seen as, well, this is traditional and old school and this is what it is to be contemporary photography. I think that there's certainly quite a bit of wonderfully innovative new media. I mean, I went to see Emil Stipp's video collection, of sort of a curatorial kind of take on his works yesterday, and I was blown away. I think, there's video art, there's incredible installation, painting. So I think over time it will all have equal importance, but I think that obviously there was a matter of curatorial preference and taste that went into that, decision-making process with foreign collectors around African photography.
Thanks, Kenneth. We had a question from Tracy. Any others? I'll come to you next. Thanks.
Thanks. Question for Warren. Being very provoked by your descriptions of where a collector should potentially be going. And I think for me it raises the question of what is the distance between the collector and the curator? So somebody that goes from being sort of the market entity to the conceptual entity in relation to selecting work, so that it's not just accumulation. And I suppose it also depends where on the scale of being a collector you are. You're starting up, you've said that even your own collection is quite haphazard, as most of ours begin. You're driven by desire. That desire often, as Oba has described, becomes a compulsion. But at what point is the imperative there to start actually defining your collection in a more refined way, or is it about accumulating many works by a single artist so that, because in both instances, I think that what one is trying to do, whether it's consciously or instinctively, is to start representing work that has value to you. And often the accumulation, I mean, with the way that Gordon collects, is to gather as many works as possible by a particular artwork so that you're actually creating a type of legacy that's formulated that way.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, your question's great, and there's one word came right at the end, which is unfair, but I think every great collection is defined by that, and that's the nature of legacy. And I don't particularly do it myself, but I'm very conscious of what a masterpiece represents and how that, whatever that masterpiece is, and how that will evolve in the consciousness, not just of time, but inside the fact of museums and the way it will exist. Because when things are very expensive, when things are very important, they get protected. It's a very funny thing. That's why it's when artists don't make the envelope, if that's a term, and they actually just never get to a pricing level that's not high enough, the works always get destroyed. And, you know, being a specialist in print, you don't know how many Rorkestrift, John Mufengejos, Cyprian Shalakos, Eric Mabatas, I mean, whoever it might be, I've seen with holes through them, crumpled up creases, and I asked the guy, like, you know, whoever brought it in, what is the problem here? I don't know, but you know, the thing only cost me 12 Rand in 1971, and you know, the frame cost 7 Rand. I couldn't possibly, like, you know, have spent 7 Rand on the frame. It didn't make any sense. I promise you, I've seen it with Kentridges even, because Kentridges were cheap. They were 20 Rand when he started, you know, 1980. I hate to remind people that. You know, they were. Every artist is the same. But I think, you know, this thing of mentioning in the beginning my trips, like we all travel abroad. I get really good ideas by default when I travel. And one of the great ideas I got was a previous trip 2 years ago, and I went to Florence. And I'm not much one for the Renaissance. I've really tried to concentrate on the 20th century and up. So I'm not my favorite sort of field. But I was absolutely dumbfounded in Florence. I mean, it was just epiphanal on every level. Going to the Galileo Museum is one thing. But very quickly, all roads sort of somehow lead to the very important powers that be, and particularly the Medicis. And then you see what these people did. I mean, as patrons, and of course they're very wealthy, and that's unfortunate. It precludes most of us. We can't play the roles of the Saatchis and you know, these massive patrons. But you've got to take their model, because at least by taking their model, you aim higher, and you can actually do it yourself. Even if you only end up with one masterpiece, you don't have to have 100, but you can do it. You mustn't think yourself down and say, well, my budget's only 20,000, or I can only afford something for 10,000. That's the only reason I'm bringing the financial side into it. I think any art's valid to buy, and you must support your friends and support artists you admire. But if you want to make a lasting impact and leave some kind of legacy, you then try and get into this model of like, what will other people see as an important, as being important? Now, William, in those lectures he gave recently at WITS, they were absolutely wonderful, those Norton lectures. He said something so profound and simple. He said you need two things as an artist to be someone like him. You need someone to sell your work, but most importantly, you put it second, you need people to write about you. So the commercial world's actually not important, and I say that as being a commercial operative. I don't give it any credence. I respect the people, whether it's White Cube Gallery in London, whoever it might be, Marion Goodman in New York. I absolutely respect things. I've been there, and I know how difficult it is to run a tiny little thing this big that's not important and no one's ever heard of. These guys are doing the Olympics of that, and they do it like brilliantly. But the commercial world, to me, is not ultimately that important. It's actually so much based in academia, and it's a critical discourse. And because a lot of artists, this is something that's in this Duchamp, the creative act. I would ask you all, if you're interested in this debate, you've got to read this. It's very short. It's about 500 words. You can get it online. And then he talks about the possibility, which I'm very interested in. That's a role I've always played in my role as an advisor, and also more in the gallery. It's this idea of being able to rehabilitate people who were great and who slip. Because the work still exists, this thing of lasting. They just last in the wrong context. They've been forgotten. And I just think that we mustn't place so much emphasis, although I've based my talk on that because I'm knowledgeable on pricing and on the market. The commercial side is hubbub, because people have got a vested interest to tell you things are good. Their well-being's dependent on their well-beings are quite pretty, actually. They're not just marginal. You know, it's the 7th Lamborghini and so on for the big people. So, you know, they've got vested interests about who's the best artist. But time, there's only one ingredient in this business, like with most things in life, and it's time. And that's the evolution of consciousness. You should stick your ground, you should do your research and stand behind the things. And you're going to go through some bad weather, but stick by them, and you're probably going to be right. And I think that's what. And also listen to people who you really respect. And those are the academics and the writers and the intellectuals.
Hello. Hi. I just want to comment on what you said about why are there so few black art collectors. I think, in my opinion, is that there's not a wide enough culture of art in the black communities, and I think that's what needs to be grown more than asking why aren't there enough collectors, because collecting and buying art is the last stage in the whole process, where there's the person who creates, and then there's viewing the art, and then in the end acquiring the art. So I think it starts from the bottom, where there are a lot of people creating art, but a lot of black people creating the artworks, but not a lot of them are actually in the culture of creating and exhibiting, and then going on to the next stage of selling the works as a full-blown culture. So yeah, it's just a short comment on that.
Thanks. Would you like to comment on that?
I'd actually respectfully disagree. I think it is a little bit of a vicious circle. I think, from what I've seen just in the few years I've been collecting, there is a lot of amazing art. But you have to travel to Lagos to see it. You have to travel to Nairobi to see it. You have to travel to Mozambique to see it. It's there, but there aren't enough collectors. And the problem with that is that being an artist is hard in any culture. But being an artist in an environment where you don't have collectors, it's hard to survive. So if you are a talented artist, you'll probably have another job on the side, or actually say, I'm going to give up being an artist because actually I'd like to have wife and kids, or a family, so I won't do it. So I think collectors are important because collectors support artists, and they give them the freedom to create art, and also create honest art that's not necessarily made just to sell. Because one thing I've seen in Uganda, which doesn't have a big collecting culture, say, in comparison to Nigeria or South Africa, is that artists create work that they think will sell. So a lot of it is derivative, a lot of it is repetitive, a lot of it is, I guess, not really deep and meaningful. It's purely decorative. There's nothing wrong with decorative art, but this is all it is. They want to sell that work because there isn't a class of collectors who are looking at art, discussing art, reading about art, and thinking about buying it. So I think you need the collectors to support the artists. The art is there. And I'd like to also pick up on one thing that Warren said. One thing that I've realized in the short time I've been doing this is that if people aren't writing about artists, they don't exist, which I found quite interesting. So you might see some amazing work, and you're like, why isn't this guy famous? But a curator hasn't picked him up, he's not in an art magazine. It's actually quite interesting, and I think that also needs to happen more. So, for example, if you do see somebody who's interesting, blog about it, tweet about it, tell your friends about it, because I think that as well will encourage people to think, actually, there is art here, maybe I can afford it, maybe I can buy it.
Yeah, thank you, Sonali. I think if your point, I think, is that the black artists, there are not enough of them exhibiting their work, so we haven't got to that stage yet. So the collectors come after that, and I kind of see it, but I'm not sure that is the real reason, because I'll just give you an example. Nigeria, what you're seeing are a lot of do-it-yourself collectives for artists. So they're finding ways of showing their work. You're seeing pop-ups under the bridges, under Echo Bridge. You just see an art collection, an exhibition. Reclaim land, they're using their environment to display their work. They're working with the community to show how to recycle some of the things that are thrown away but could be exhibited. So I'm not sure. I sort of gravitate to the importance of more black collectors. I think artists are very, very resourceful, and they do eventually find a way of showing their work. But the 2 points I would make also about, certainly at my stage, which is why I sort of describe myself as an amateur and haphazard. When I look, for example, and I give it because Emil is here, look at his collection. He has a sort of curatorial approach to it. So he really acquires a lot of knowledge about the artist and the time the artist is working in, the sort of things that are influencing the artist, and you can see there's a real rigor to the way he collects, which I don't have. It's sort of, mine is accidental. If I get a theme, it's accidental, and I follow it for a bit. And I think also to pick up on what Warren said, but to take it one stage further about people writing about an artist and an artist becoming prominent that way, I think that can be abused, because some of the things I've seen behind the scenes is what I would describe as market manipulation, where an artist may not be any better than the next artist, but the people who control the market effectively ensure that that artist has the greatest prominence and the greatest value. So they're the ones that effectively control the prices, which is why I think you have these cycles of prices where if the manipulators lose interest, the artist dips. It may be a crude way of looking at it, but even some of the finest auction houses, that you see, the recent scandals you've had with Sotheby's and Bonhams, just shows you the level of sophistication with market manipulation, which is why when you come back to being a collector, that word that I think one of you mentioned is the issue of legacy from your own point of view. What legacy are you leaving as a collector? And leave aside the market doers and the commercial values and the ups and downs. At the end of the day, where are you going with your collection?
This might sound a bit obscure, but I think it's such a great question. I collect a lot of things, so I can give a very unusual answer here. I'm very interested in music and have been since I was at school, and one of the fields I collect is South African jazz, but original pressings on vinyl. I have a big ephemera collection, a poster collection of to do with apartheid, so it's something that interests me a great deal. And I have a report written in 1966 where 67% of the black African population were below the poverty line in South Africa, the wealthiest country in the world. Between 1960 and 1970 was our emergent period. We were the wealthiest country in the world, but so many of our population were below the poverty line. You can't even eat. People are dying of starvation. So I honestly believe your question's more pertinent than you think. People could literally not eat 40 years ago. Now, I know through jazz, because I have jazz records I've bought because I'm a collector and I'm passionate 20 years ago when I was still at school, that it's perverse. On eBay and so on now, they're worth 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 rand. There's a simple answer. Gallo Tone, one of the big companies that controlled the music industry 40 years ago, only pressed 300 of these records because there was no market, because the black people of South Africa, the big jazz supporters, were all below the poverty line. They couldn't even afford to buy a needle for a gramophone, a box of needles. A gramophone was unheard of. So one person would own a gramophone. They would share a record. There was no digital downloads and tapes and things 50 years ago, and people would sit with friends, 10, 20 people at a time, and listen to a record. So it shows you basically how much of a catch-up has had to take place post-94. And of course, there have been a lot of people who've been successful in that catch-up in the black African population, South African population. But there's so many who still remain marginalized. And then on top of it, once you actually have got into it, you have been able to reestablish yourself or create this new legacy where you actually have wealth for the first time. You might move into the middle class for the first time. That's what's happened in China. A priority for you is not to collect art. I mean, it's to have your first television sets, to have a great car, it's to move into a up more sort of affluent suburb. I'm not against, I love art, but I'm also not naive to the fact it's not a huge priority for a lot of people who've had a very difficult life.